World Regions Geography, Lecture 3, Part 2. The ecological land and environmental management. So there's 5 zones of climate patterns. Tundra, which is in the far north. This is a view of what tundra looks like. Mostly northerly, Arctic wilderness. Winters are bleak, weak daylight, lots of snow, a lot of permafrost, summers, long days, bogs and marshes, indigenous peoples, reindeer herding. So you have a lot of indigenous people that live in Siberia and that region, and up in the very northern part by Finland and Norway, the Lapps up in that region, and they're primarily reindeer herders, very traditional lifestyle, pastoralists. The taiga, which is most extensive zone, it's coniferous forest. It's a spruce, fir, and pine forest, and there are a lot of fur-bearing animals. Most of the furs available in the world come out of Russia and Siberia. The mixed forest, large-scale logging operations, and privatization of timber industry. This is another one of the industries taken over by oligarchs, and they're not necessarily, they're not under the same environmental regulations that timber companies might be in the U.S. or Canada, the other two big logging countries. Environmental concerns, lots of devastation, clear cutting. You can see this is probably clear cutting going on right here, it looks like. But this taiga forest stretches from Finland in the west, which is the Baltic coast, all the way across to the Bering Strait. The steppe area is the flat grassland, has limited rainfall, cleared for agriculture, big grain growing areas. You see harvesting going on here. Wheat and corn are the big crops. It's the wheat belt, cotton and corn. This almost looks like it could be, that's probably wheat. And semi-arid desert is Central Asia, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan. Salt pans, nomadic pastoralists. So pastoralists are people that herd animals pasture to pasture. Nomadic means they move, so they're not sedentary. They're moving from place to place, following the water, following the grass. Extensive sand dunes, scattered oases with fertile valleys. The challenges to sustainability in the region. Overexploitation of the Aral Sea. A lot of the water in the Aral Sea, which is in Central Asia, if you look right here, I think it's right in here. This yellow line right here is where the Aral Sea used to extend to. Now it's shrunk down, and it's because during the Soviet era, lots of water, these rivers that drained into this, are diverted for cotton growing. So this region's become a major producer of cotton. And the consequence is what you see right here. Where it used to be fishing and shipping, it's now largely a desert, much smaller, and the water's being diverted to grow cotton. Increased hazards of summer fires because you have global warming and you have less water, a lot of fires. Offshore oil drilling threatens the marine ecosystem. So in the Aral Sea area, they're drilling for oil, and it has a potential to ruin the marine ecosystems. Furs. There's about 15 billion in global retail sales. They're a status symbol and a luxury item. And the controversies over extinctions of species and then the practices of fur farming. You can see some fur farming going on here. Activism, little activism there. and it's now fashionable again to wear furs, depending on where you're at and when. Everyone's probably heard of the historical legacies and landscapes of Russia. The Silk Road, stretching from across Central Asia, connected China to the Mediterranean. Since before the Roman times, maybe back as long as the Greeks, there was trade between China and the Mediterranean. This region here was controlled by various tribes, and passage took quite a long time. Samarkand is the famous city in the center of Central Asia, and it is a center for mathematics, music, and Islamic architecture from the 18th and 19th century. It was built. The Khans, those were the rulers, the Central Asian, like Mongols, rulers at the time were Khans. They were nomadic people in the region. The Khans were actually the leaders of like Mongols, Tartars, and various other tribes. The Uyghurs and actually the Turks came out of this region. The Ottoman Turks that conquered the Middle East, all came out of this region. The Principality of Muscovy, the rise of the Russian Empire. So when the Mongols from this region ruled all of this area, China all the way to Syria, including Moscow was a subservient state. Muscovy was the Duchy of Muscovy, was a subservient state to the Tartars until 1552, when Ivan the Terrible defeated the Tartars and began a steady expansion of Russian dominance. So they first started expanding this direction and this direction. So they gradually grew in this area, and eventually, with Peter, took this area over here where Petersburg is, St. Petersburg, from the Finns so they could have a warm water port, and all the way down into the Crimea to try to get a warm water port also. So the Tsars were the title of the rulers of the Russian Empire, and at one time the Russian Empire extended across the Bering Straits to Alaska, with the most southern Russian fort was in Fort Ross, which is up in Sonoma County. Early 20th century, Russia suffered a severe depression, and the Soviets were a subversive group during the Russian Empire, early part of the 20th century. They were protesting, they were discontent, they wanted to overthrow, they wanted to establish a proletariat regime. Lenin was the leader. Trotsky was another one of the leaders. Stalin was a lieutenant of Lenin. World War I came. The Tsars were further put into disfavor because they were beaten by the Germans. And so in October 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution, where the Soviets overthrew the regime that had removed the Tsar and took the Tsar. The last Tsars were killed and established the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. The state socialism is that Marxist-Leninist, with all people bending to the will. Lenin was an internationalist, which means he favored control over a large area and expansion into the West, and pure revolutionary, trying to get the revolutionary message out. founded the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Stalin, when Lenin passed away, Stalin took over. He was an anti-nationalist. So he went around and devastated populations. He had a collectivism where they starved something like 2 or 3 million Ukrainians when they took the family farms and put them into large Soviet collectives. He had no problem shipping people to Siberia. During the 30s, some estimates are as high as 35 million people died during the purges and various programs that Stalin orchestrated in the USSR. Now, the expansion into Eastern Europe by Stalin was largely after World War II. So with the collapse of Germany, Russian armies had pushed all the way into Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, and this area was largely ceded by the West to the Soviets. And the Soviets formed a buffer state with severe repression. There was two real major events: the 1956 uprising in Hungary, and then the Czechoslovakia uprising in '67, that were crushed by Soviet military. The rise of the Russian Empire, growth, territorial production complexes. What these were cities and complexes located near raw materials. So like you would have iron and you would have coal, and so you would make a steel making complex near that, so that you're mining the iron ore and you're mining the coal and you're manufacturing the steel, all in regions. And there were all these complexes all over the former Soviet Union. They tried to have secret cities. This area here was the area where Russian space exploration was largely directed from Kazakhstan. The Cold War, which was post-World War II, like 47 through 89. This says 50 through 89, but communism challenged the dominance of capitalism. In other words, two political economic systems. State control of the economy, free market. And capitalism won. The Western capitalism won, and now is the dominant economic system on the globe, with very few. There's been a couple of, Venezuela has tried to undermine capitalism in South America, but it has not really worked very well. The proxy conflicts, what they're talking about there, are little wars that have gone on all over, whether it's in the Middle East, Korea, Vietnam, where basically the U.S. and the Soviet Union fought, but they let somebody else do the fighting for the most part.